Welcome to the Rejected Religion podcast. I'm Stephanie Shea. This month's guest is Dr. Jenny Butler. Jenny is a faculty member of the College of Arts, Celtic Studies, and Social Sciences, and sits on the College Executive Management Committee and on the Academic Council of University College Cork in Ireland. In the Study of Religions department, she is Director of Graduate Studies and teaches on contemporary religions in Ireland, Western esotericism, and new religious movements. She is an established researcher and scholar in the area of new religious movements and the study of folk religion, and is also the president of the Irish Society for the Academic Study of Religions. Her bio is quite vast, and I recommend you check out the link in the program notes for the full list of her activities and memberships. Jenny is currently working on a comparative ethnographic project called Fairy Lore and Landscapes on non-ordinary beings and landscapes, which explores the interconnections of worldviews, customs, and sense of place as intangible cultural heritage. Her key interests are theory and method in the study of religions, the intersection of religions and national identities, death studies, and the study of new religious movements and emergent religious traditions, which are, of course, very relevant for this month's conversation. I apologize for the audio issues that crop up from time to time during the interview. It sounds as if a ghostly character from the Otherworld is also trying to join the conversation at times. Rather fitting, as the springboard for this discussion was the festival of Samhain, or Halloween. In part one, Jenny starts by explaining the meanings of the terms neo-pagan and pagan, and why she has stopped using the first term and opts instead for contemporary pagan. We then delve into the topic of death and how death and the dead are viewed in Irish traditions, as well as in some contemporary pagan views. The conversation extends into the roles of women and traditions such as keening that are associated with Irish wakes, as well as female otherworldly characters such as the banshee that are associated with the dead, the otherworld, and the divine feminine. I hope you enjoy this first part. Welcome to the podcast, Jenny.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be on Rejected Religion podcast.
It is a great pleasure to talk to you today. I'm so happy that you had time for me to talk about death and the dead. By the time this interview is uploaded, Halloween will have already taken place. But I'd like to use this holiday as a springboard for our discussion today. And in doing some preparation for this discussion today, I've read several of your interviews that you've been so kind to, not several of your interviews, several of your articles for this interview that you have put on academia.edu. And I will be sure to have those linked in the program notes for those who would also care to read up on all of the different topics that we're going to be talking about today. But the idea that I had for this interview, this discussion, kind of came from the ideas that I was thinking about, how the general public associates Halloween with ghosts and vampires and zombies and werewolves, witches, all of those, kind of scary, ghoulish type of figures that seem to represent feelings and ideas that people have in general about the dead and death and what happens to us or could happen to us after we die, and the spirit world that living people need protection from, in some cases, the undead or other entities that are associated with or created by some form of magic, And of course, witchcraft, that's always a big theme during Halloween. But from, I guess, like the general context of this being some kind of evil thing that's associated with the devil or with demons or black magic and things like that. So Halloween, or Samhain, is also associated with otherworldly entities from the underworld or the other world, such as fairies. And additionally, Samhain is a festival that is associated with nature and the season of death. So as you well know, there's so much material that could be covered here as it relates to Irish mythology and traditions and folklore, as well as pagan or neo-pagan beliefs. But when I was thinking about all of the questions that came up, I thought, well, maybe it would be a good idea first to define what you mean by pagan or neo-pagan. Because as you point out in your work, there are differing opinions about what these terms mean, and especially with regard to the etic discourses. So could you talk a little bit more about this and then what the terms mean as you use them?
Yes. So in my own work, I've stopped using neo-pagan, so I'll explain why in a moment. So in the academic study of new religions, academics have used neo-pagan. So neo just means new, and it's a term for this globalized new religious movement that generally started in the 1950s, but particularly in the 1960s started to grow, and the different traditions or paths, the different types of paganism, became more popular and had a higher public profile from that time on. So neo-pagan is to distinguish the new religious movement and religious and cultural movement and from ancient so-called paganism with a small p, if you like, because many academics as well as practitioners prefer to capitalize pagan as a religious tradition because the Abrahamic faiths and other religions are capitalized. So I mentioned the small p, paganism, as an ancient religious forms. So the term pagan originates in a context where the Roman soldiers were calling people on the hinterlands, people who hadn't converted to Christianity, they were calling them pagani. So literally it means country dweller. So it has that association with nature, but apparently in that context, these people who hadn't converted to Christianity, the word pagan had a connotation of almost like country bumpkin. So it's a reclaimed word by practitioners in the modern day as a reconnection with nature religion or animism. And the problem with the term paganism is that it's used in many different contexts and to mean different things. So, for example, many indigenous religions are sometimes referred to as pagan, or in Ireland, for example, the word pagan has been used for someone by Catholic clergy in particular, for people who have no religion or who are somehow antagonistic to Christianity. So another phrase like that is a godless heathen. So the heathenism then is another reclaimed term coming from the same root word as heather, so heather or heath. So these words are claimed, by modern practitioners, and it's important to say that a new religious movement can be quite well established. This is an academic term, for it's usually in comparison to the Abrahamic faiths, so Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and other things are measured against that long-standing kind of religious tradition. So the reason that I stopped using neo-pagan, like initially I was using it to distinguish the ancient Celtic religion, pre-Christian traditions in Ireland from the new religious movement that I'm examining through ethnographic research. But as time went on, I decided to avoid using it where I can, neo-pagan, because many pagan practitioners feel that this is an academic imposition. It's you mentioned emic and etic categories. So most pagans do not call themselves neo-pagan, and many feel that it's the use of this term by academics is an attempt to undermine this religious tradition, or to, suggest that it's inauthentic. So there's some sensitivity around the use of neo-pagan and the term New Age as well. So many pagans would regard the New Age as something separate from them, what they do, and their religion and their cultural practices. And similarly for many academics, it's they're two separate categorizations, so that can vary. So yeah, I would say now I tend to use contemporary pagan as the designation.
Pagan. Okay. Yeah, that's very clear. Thank you for explaining that, because it is a kind of a complex discussion when you get into it, because in an academic sense, academics are looking at it as a new religion, actually, because they're not able to find any, as far as I understand, they're not able to find any historical record of the traditions that the contemporary pagans are claiming to have recovered, or I don't know what other words they might use for that, but that there is this old tradition. There seems to be a differing in opinions as to if this religion is really so old as the contemporary pagan practitioners claim it is. So there is kind of a tension there. I don't know if you want to add anything to that. You probably can explain that much better than I just did.
Well, I mean, it's true that many contemporary pagan practices can't, at least in this part of the world, they can't be traced right back to ancient paganism. But there are. So there's two things that I would identify as processes. So one is the connections that contemporary pagans would make with traditional, popular practices or vernacular religious practices. So in the Irish context, that would be popular Catholicism. So things like pilgrimage traditions, traditional festival celebrations, things to do with the fairies and places on the landscape, many different things that we might identify as folk religiosity or syncretism, or this kind of mixture of different religious elements. But for most contemporary pagans, they would take aspects or connect with aspects of the traditional practices that they view as being pagan. So they kind of strip away what they view as the Christian bits. So for example, on St. Bridget's Day on the 1st of February in Ireland, there's a traditional celebration of Saint Bridget. So Saint Bridget is a Christianized goddess, Brede or Bridget, and so there's a popular tradition across Ireland, right into the modern day, of making a Bridget's cross, and some pagans do this, but it's for the goddess. It's like a bypassing of what they understand as like the Christian parts of it, because it stretches back before Christianity in its origin. And then the so that's the connection with the kind of vernacular religiosity. But then there's also the looking back into the distant past. So contemporary practitioners looking at archaeological evidence, let's say, and sites on the landscape, and also things like mythological sources, and putting that together to try to not really recreate, but reconnect with that ancient form of religiosity. So there is awareness among contemporary pagans that it's not possible to reconstruct that ancient form of paganism, because it didn't continue in that way. You know, the country was Christianized,
right,
many things were lost. So there's different processes going on. So it's more a spiritual connection by way of the information that's available.
Right. And you write about this in many of your articles. You mentioned that there seems to be an idea of reclaiming a past that had been, I guess, taken away from them, and a tradition that had been taken away from them by Christianity. I can't remember the art. I read many of your articles, so I can't recall the specific one, but you mentioned a woman performing a ritual and making a statement about I'm taking this back from the church, and I can't even remember what it was now. That I think it had to do with the woman that you interviewed, the artist. She was trying to make a statement in so many words that this is not Catholic, or this is not Christian, as the Christians like to make it out to be, but this is actually older, and this is ours. It's not theirs. So kind of a territorial thing as well.
I've come across lots of different examples of that, so I'm not sure if I'm thinking of the same example, but I know that I interviewed a woman who makes corn dollies, these kind of fertility symbols, and she was climbing a mountain named Croagh Patrick, which it's named for Saint Patrick, and
that's what it was.
It's the biggest Catholic pilgrimage in Ireland, and she climbed it and put the corn dolly in a part of the mountain known as St. Patrick's Bed, where part of the Catholic tradition is to circle this Patrick's Bed. So she did say something about reclaiming the mountain for paganism or something like that.
No, that's exactly the example that I couldn't remember. So you hit it right on the head. So you have the right one. So yeah, I find that interesting. And this is, I think, outside of even academic discourse and research. I think that a lot of people have this idea that a lot of the traditions that we have, like say around Christmas with a Christmas tree and all these types of things that Christianity kind of took on and made it, kind of altered it a bit to make it fit with their quote unquote agenda and what they wanted to, their dogma, what they wanted to promote. So I think that idea is out there, and it's not hard to imagine. It's not hard to wrap your head around that idea that it could be of something that was taken and altered to a degree. So yeah, I found that really interesting. So thanks for explaining that, because I think that's an important beginning point so that the context is understood. So when we're talking about Celtic pagan viewpoints, that it's in this context. So, okay. So we've got that out of the way with the academic terms and all of this and that. So, but getting back to the topic of death, in Celtic pagan belief systems, generally speaking, how is the subject of death and the dead viewed? Does it differ greatly from like a general notion that it's kind of a scary thing, or maybe like bad omens, or things could be associated with ghosts, which is, also kind of a negative type of thing that you want to like stay away from these types of things? Is there a different viewpoint in this regard with the pagans?
So I'd like to try to be clear that if I'm talking like Celtic pagan worldview is very diverse. So there's I mentioned different pagan paths or traditions or types. So the types, I'm only talking here about the types that I have researched in the Irish context. So pagan witchcraft, including Wicca and Druidry, and also people who might just self-identify as pagan generically without following a particular path, as they're called. But even within one type of paganism, like Wicca or Druidry or whatever, there are very diverse views. So, I can talk about characteristic features, but people sometimes believe very different things, and they're still pagan. There's no, you mentioned dogma a while ago, there's no set doctrine within these forms of paganism. So people are free to believe what they want and to practice in the way that they see fit. So it's quite free form that way. So in relation to death, generally speaking, in paganism, death is part of the cycle of life. So there's a phrase, birth, death, rebirth. So the circle of life, the circle as a symbol is quite significant in paganism. In each different type of paganism that I've mentioned, the magical space is known as the circle, but a ritual group can also be known as a circle. So there's a lot of symbolism around circles and cycles, and practitioners view themselves and their lives in relation to these wider cycles of nature, of the seasons, of cosmic, the sun and moon and those cycles, and also death is part of life in the cycle of life. So it's not a negative thing. Everything in nature dies eventually. And when I say rebirth, this can be variously interpreted. So some pagans do believe in reincarnation, or talk about reincarnation, or the transmigration of souls. So there is a reference to ancient Druids that they believed in the transmigration of souls, where the spirit goes into another human or animal at the point of death. I think that's what it means. Or some have other ideas of what reincarnation means, maybe being influenced by Eastern religions like Hinduism or maybe Buddhism. And so there's a mixture of different influences on contemporary pagan cosmology and worldview. So death as part of life. Just to mention as well that not some pagans believe in an afterlife, others don't. Some see this cycle of life as everything that there is. That when you die, you just become part of the earth again. And maybe the rebirth is, the trees and things that come from the soil. So there can be very different interpretations. Right. And the afterlife as well. So that the modern Celtic paganism is connecting with the distant past through those sources of archaeology and the mythological material. So in Ireland, we have the early Irish literature, medieval manuscripts that were written down by Christian scribes. So the afterlife, there's some references to the other world, the spiritual realm, in those texts, but it's not clear whether there's a distinct afterlife or whether the other world is the same place. This is ambiguous. So kind of out of that, then modern pagans might think that the other world, the spiritual realm, is the same place that the dead go to, or they might understand that there's two different realms.
Okay. I guess we could come back to the afterlife topic in just a moment, because I did want to ask if there were any rituals that you know of or preparations that some Celtic pagans practice with regard to like an end of life cycle. Do you know of any rituals that help people prepare for their own death?
I haven't come across rituals specifically for preparing for one's own death, but it's not something I've asked about either. In my research.
Right.
That's interesting actually. That's an interesting question. But with someone who's dying, for example, or close to death, I know that people have pagans who know that person would do rituals or send energy to not so much for healing, but to help that person on their journey as they're dying. So, it's usually magic. With the people I've interviewed, the general definition or way of talking about magic is that it's an energy. So the ritual or a spell, depending on the kind of paganism, people might talk about spells or rituals, is, it's just to raise energy, whether that energy is coming from the people conducting the ritual or person, or from the earth energy of the on the ground. If it's depending on the nature of the ritual, if it's outside, or maybe some kind of energy that comes through people. So there's different influences from different like esoteric, different occult practices, but also different cultures. The idea of like prana as something that comes through you, or many pagan practitioners would also be practitioners of things like Reiki or crystal healing or herbalism. There's so many overlaps there with different kinds of so-called energy healing. So the types of ritual would also be influenced by that.
So is this seen then as a way to help the dying person, like easing their way into this next, whatever this may be, afterlife or next world or next incarnation or whatever it might however that might look, or even just releasing the energy, perhaps, if you don't believe in afterlife, or that the soul goes to another place, that it's just an easing of that transitioning into death.
Yes. So I found, like, in different situations, there has been a coordinated ritual practice. Like, people could be in different countries even, but do a ritual at the same time. Mm-hmm. So they're sending energy, but it relates to what the person sending it, what their intent is. So as you mentioned, for some people it might be their intent is to ease the passing, maybe hasten that sounds terrible, but to hasten the death. I'm thinking of in traditional Irish culture, there's what's known as an easy death, where somebody, if somebody is lingering, and they're going to die, they're just in pain, or they're lingering. There are traditions around that, like taking the person out of their bed and putting them on a straw. So some have interpreted this as it's not so comfortable, so it's kind of like if you're making the person very comfortable, you might actually be kind of drawing this out, this process.
Okay.
Others have made a connection to that it's something to do with Christianity and the traditional practice, maybe the straw, and the stable, and people. There's always a kind of folk interpretations of things as well, because people try to make sense of customs, but there is this concept of in traditional Irish culture of helping somebody to pass on. And another example of that historically would be the habit or the death shroud that would be brought out. It was like a brown or black garment, and the person would touch the shroud. So this is also to like a kind of an acknowledgement that they're going to die soon, and maybe a way to help them to let go.
Right.
So I suppose in contemporary paganism, for some people, sending the energy might be part of that. For others, it would be more geared towards the person going on their journey to the afterlife, to just send them some positive energy or to help them along.
Sure. Yeah. Understood. You wrote an article called Symbolic Roles of Women in Death Ritual in Traditional Irish Society, which I found very interesting. And I never really thought about this, that there is a gender aspect to this as well. Could you elaborate on how women seem to have a greater connection to this whole process and to this idea of the other world, as you talk about?
Yeah, so in Irish tradition, the funeral is known as the wake. So it's sometimes called the merry wake because of its celebratory atmosphere. And it's a wake because it's a vigil, so people would stay awake and watch over the body. And women have many associations in traditional Irish culture, as in many cultures, with the other world, with the spiritual realm, and particularly with death. So this is also the case in many parts of Europe, especially that women have this very strong association with death and dealing with death. So being the ones who deal with the body, and sometimes organize aspects of the funeral, and then the lament tradition as well. So in Ireland, there's historically, so some of these traditions have died out now. There was what's known as the white woman, so an ban Vaughan. So in the Irish language, ban is woman and Vaughan is white. So the white woman or women would be people who would lay out the dead body. So wash the body, and before there were funeral homes and things, they would have a very visceral connection, like, washing the corpse and plugging the orifices, this kind of thing, that people are kind of separated from now. And there traditionally there's a taboo on the family dealing with death, so that these white women are associated with death, so they're usually not the direct family members, and the body would be laid out on either in the coffin or in a bed, depending on the house. Historically, so the wake would take place in the house, and the woman of the house, as the usually the wife, would be known as and ban on tea. So ban being woman and tea is the house. So she would be responsible, or the daughters as well, depending on the situation, would be responsible for ensuring that there's enough food and drink for the wake. So in Ireland, it's very important, as in other cultures as well, but it's very important to give someone a good send-off, as it's known, to be hospitable and to have enough to go around if people are visiting the house. And so that was also the role of women, and still is to a large extent today in Irish culture. And then the keening woman, so the lamenter. The word keening is an anglicised term, so it's in Irish queena, which is crying, so the crying woman. And the keeners, so this tradition died out, and the keener would either accompany the coffin along the road, or would gather at the graveside and ritually lament the dead. So this is very strongly associated with women. It was partly it declined because of the church, particularly Roman Catholic Church, but also Protestant churches, tried to stamp out keening. So they tried to ban it, and effectively they tried to ban crying at funerals. Because this was viewed as a pagan tradition, and also because it was in the domain of women. So the clergy didn't like that women had important roles at the funeral. So they also saw it as a uncouth, as so-called barbaric custom. So we know this from church records and things that bishops and different clerics said over hundreds of years, which shows, well, actually not over hundreds of years, but we have records from 19th century, for example. So over a long time period. So we know that the church opposition to it wasn't effective, because not immediately anyway, because people kept doing this. So it was obviously a very important tradition. And there's also at least one reference to a cleric attacking keening women physically with a whip from the horses. So we can speculate that there would have been contentious kind of situations with keening women and clergy, given the things that were said about keening and examples like that. So
I was just wondering if it could also have something to do with the nature of the keening and also of the other rituals that you described in your article that seem to be quite sensual in nature. And perhaps this went against this very prim and proper attitude that the church had about, and maybe even in society, if you're talking 19th century ideal of this very rigid, stiff type of behavior that one was expected to perform or to hold to. And this keening, I mean, you're ripping at your clothes, you could be baring your breast because, you tear your clothes off, or because it could be quite demonstrative. So that perhaps could that also have played a role in what is considered proper behavior in public?
Yes, as you mentioned, the tearing at the breasts, this has been referenced specifically as being something that was considered shocking, or the many associations with fertility at the wake. So there were also sexually suggestive wake games. So the church, the Catholic Church, also tried to ban wakes in general. They even threatened excommunication if people went to wakes. So they were trying to gain control of these rituals. And and also stamp out what they regarded as pagan practices. So this was more, when I say the church, I mean more local clerics and bishops, rather than the Catholic Church as an institution.
Right.
But I mean, the keening has many associations with sensuality, as you said, and it's like an expression of the whole community's grief. So it was really, the descriptions we have of it are, very dramatic performance. So it's also performance, and they would have torn at their hair, and their hair would have been loose, and they'd been bare feet. So this, that's a good point to talk about the fertility and sexual associations. So this is another, like the wake itself was known as a place where couples could meet up unobserved. So you have that association with fertility and the wake house.
Right.
So, Ireland in the time period that we're talking about, where there would have been the wake as a usual tradition, Ireland was very suppressed and controlled. So the clergy used to go, like, there was matchmaking as well. So, young couples, unmarried people were not able to be on their own. There were very few situations where they could be on their own, because even on a date or courting, as it was known, the matchmaker would go with them. So then there were dances, but there'd usually be a priest in the corner watching everyone. So, Ireland today, I think people, while, there's still strong influence by the church, it's still a Roman Catholic, Roman Catholicism is still the hegemonic or the dominant religious tradition here. The schools are still, if not directly run by Catholic or Protestant clerics, they are they still own the land of most of the schools, and they're still on the school board. So but having said that, it's changed a lot from that kind of control that I'm talking about. So any sexual associations would have been viewed, as abhorrent by Catholic clergy in particular. So that's
right. So have the wakes endured? Are wakes still happening in Ireland now, or has that kind of died out now?
It hasn't died out completely. Some people might still have the body laid out at home, and people would visit the house, but it's not so common. So what is much more common in Ireland is there's a removal, where people go to the funeral home, which is usually the evening before the funeral, and then they go to the funeral the next day. But in the past, it used to be everything in the house, and then the body that was taken out in the coffin directly to the graveyard. Things, different traditions died out at different times. Yeah. So, the keening, we had the Irish Folklore Commission from 1935 to 1970. They had field workers who went out and collected different aspects of folklore. But there's no recordings of keening. So unfortunately, they may have recorded some, but they used Edaphone before there were tape recorders. They didn't come in until the 1950s. Before that, there were Edaphone machines, and they had wax cylinders, and apparently it was very expensive, so they used to reuse them. So I suppose it didn't occur to people to record something like that, because you assume that things are going to stay the same,
Right.
But or even things like accents and things that have changed. But like the keening died out completely, and then the tradition of laying the body out at home continued. I've talked to people in their 60s and 70s who remember going to wakes, and being one man was telling me he was traumatized because you were made kiss the corpse. You couldn't leave, he said, until you kissed the corpse. So it was like this seemed to be an important aspect of saying goodbye. And so, that's just a generation ago. So it didn't completely die out.
Right.
So it's just become a lot less common here now. But people would know what you meant if you said awake, that you were going to awake, or maybe confusingly in England, they say wake for a funeral. So this is probably the Irish emigrants there. So lots of Irish went to London and Liverpool particularly, but, they call a funeral awake, but they don't actually mean they're going to awake.
Oh, right. So they're confusing the terms, thinking that it's the same.
The term continued just as the word for a funeral there, which is interesting.
Right. Well, as an American with an Irish heritage, it's very clear to me to understand what awake is. Awake is not a funeral. It's something completely different, actually. So yeah, interesting. I didn't know that the word was used in such different ways. So, okay. So that's good I learn something new every day. But I also wanted to ask you about the wailing and the keening. From the spiritual perspective, there is an entity known as a banshee that is the banshee also keening, or is this a different type of wailing that the banshee performs?
There is a connection between the banshee and the keening woman. So there is a legend. There are different legends about how the banshee came into existence. So she's known as Professor Patricia Lysett describes her as a supernatural death messenger, the banshee. So she doesn't cause death. She wails. She appears. So it's not always wailing. Some people see her, but she wails or cries for to give a message to the living that someone is about to die. So there is a legend that the banshee was a keening woman in life.
Okay.
But there are different legends about how she came into existence. There are others, that it was some tragedy, like a pregnant woman or someone who was murdered, and this became the banshee, or that she's someone who is crying for her descendants and never stop crying. So there is the interpretation. I'm talking here about the work of Dr. Garrod O'Crooley, who worked on the wake and the banshee traditions, and he talked about the keening woman being like a flesh and blood version of the banshee. Like these are almost mirror images that or symbols that the banshee is symbolically crying death into the community from the other world, and the keening woman is crying death out. So the spirit of the person is being sent into the other world, into the community of ancestors.
I see. And that happens through this wailing and crying. This sound is also involved in it. Okay.
And there are special sounds. There's kind of a refrain, O Cone O. And different, poetic performances. But it's thought that the sound, or the tone maybe has a special spiritual connection, as in other cultures, particular sounds are associated with the spiritual world.
Right. Interesting. Does can the banshee have a familial attachment? Is like, I guess just to put it very simply, does every family have their own banshee, or is it more of a general banshee that is can serve many families?
So there's different interpretations and also different regional regional
Okay.
variations. So some people think there's only one banshee, and others think there are different banshees for different families. So again, the man is woman, and she is fairy. It's translated as fairy, but there's this indigenous term in Old Irish, she or she, it might have been pronounced as. So otherworldly, or these otherworld people. So the banshee is sometimes translated as fairy woman, but she's in my mind a distinct entity, or she's an otherworldly being, but maybe not part of An Sluashi or the fairy host as they're described. So there's possibly a connection. So I'm saying possibly because we don't really know. This isn't described anywhere in any detail, or it's just hints that there might be a connection between the banshee and the sovereignty goddess tradition of Ireland, because there's stories in this early Irish literature, this medieval corpus, and there's stories of Ireland, the land, being personified as a goddess, and there are stories where these warriors encounter a so-called hag, a very frightening old woman, and one of them kisses her. Sometimes, depending, there are different poems and stories. Sometimes the suggestion is that he's having sexual intercourse with her, and she transforms into a beautiful woman, young woman. So the descriptions of the banshee, just to explain that this sovereignty goddess, there's a cup of sovereignty, like a chalice that she hands to the new king. There's many motifs around kingship and the ruling over the land. And Ireland, the name for Ireland itself comes from Eru, the goddess Erin. So there's these kinds of themes. And then the banshee, there's different descriptions. So the more common one is that she's a very old woman, frightening looking. And I say this word hag, by the way, because it's a translation of the Irish Cailleach. So it's kind of used in a non-reflective way on, that term can be quite a pejorative term.
Yeah.
So the banshee is also described as being a young, beautiful woman with long hair. So combing the hair is associated with these different descriptions of the banshee, and her having some kind of special comb with magical powers to cause death or burns, or there's a kind of saying that you shouldn't, if you come across a comb, you shouldn't touch it in case it's the banshee's comb. So where I'm going with this is the sovereignty goddess in ancient Ireland that we get glimpses at through poetry and through the mythological material. The sovereignty goddess has a connection to particular areas of land and to particular clans of people. And so ancient Ireland you had the Gaelic clans, and there were regional kings and high kings, or ardries. The ardry is the high king. So, for example, I mentioned the fairies and she, this word. There's also the term tuatha de danann for this group of mythical people that are associated in later Irish folklore with the fairies. So tuatha means like a clan or people or tribe. Anu or Dana is a goddess, so people of the goddess Anu. And this is also a sovereignty goddess connected with particular people and particular region. So it's a bit like a patron saint later in Christian tradition, becomes like connected with a particular skill or people and area. So the banshee is said, so this is where the connection comes from. Apart from the appearance of the banshee being differently described, you have this phrase that the banshee follows families with O or Mac in their name. So O in Irish is of, so it comes from Ua, which is descendant. So it's like O is of the O'Brien family, so O'Brien of the O'Brien family, and Mac is son of. So in Irish, the names are, so let's say with the name Carthy, Mac Carthy is the son of Carthy, but this became the formalized name when the Irish language was anglicized. So if there's some women would say Nick Carthig, which means daughter of, but in English the name will be McCarthy, whether they're male or female. So this changed because of colonization. But so that phrase that the banshee follows O or Mac is a way of saying she follows the Gaelic clans and not Anglo-Norman. For example, my name, Butler, is an Anglo-Norman name. It's a Norman, so like names like Fitzgerald or, other Irish names that are not Gaelic. Mm-hmm. But then in other parts of Ireland, there are legends that the banshee follows other names, that it doesn't matter what the name is. So she's said to cry for or follow particular lineages, which would be the short answer to your question.
I liked the long explanation. I find that's very interesting, that it is also associated with territory or with lineage or, that there's also this sovereign idea as well. And you also wrote in your articles about this, the different appearances, whether young or old, could be different aspects of the goddess. If you have the maiden, mother, crone idea going on, that this could be different aspects of the goddess, or am I not understanding that?
You are, but that's in contemporary paganism. So this is taken from studies of mythology, but it's become part of contemporary pagan discourse or ways of understanding cycles of life. Maiden, mother, crone. So there's a maiden, mother, crone aspect of the goddess. So this word crone, like hag, has been reclaimed. This is another kind of reclaiming. And similarly with the god, warrior, sometimes king, kind of old god, but it's more focused on the female, the divine feminine, this kind of tripartite structure. So 3 comes in, like this triple aspect does come into the Irish mythology, where there's but in a different way, like that there's 3 aspects to a goddess, maybe 3 different associated skills. So for example, the goddess Breed or Bridget, you have smith, craft, or working with metal is one association, poetry and healing. So, and this carries over to Saint Bridget as the association. So there's often 3 things associated with goddesses and gods as well, or 3 goddesses as manifestations of one goddess. So for example, there's the Morrigan, which is, so there's Morrigan, Bibe and Nevin. So Morrigan comes from Moor, which is big, and Ree, as I mentioned earlier, is king. So Morrigan is a feminine, a great queen is how it's translated. So the Morrigan is a goddess who can transform into a crow. She's described as a war goddess. Morrigan, Nemen or Nevin, depending on the pronunciation, and Bibe. So these are 3 war goddesses who can transform into crows. So they're sometimes depicted as 3 sisters or as being the same goddess. So depending on the story or the portrayal of them. But that concept of 3 divine emanations is there in ancient culture. You know, it didn't come in with the Trinity.
Right. Right.
So
An
it's
older idea.
Yeah. And because we have this story in Ireland that St. Patrick explained the Trinity by way of the shamrock to the people, but they would have already known what this meant. So,
right.
But Bibe, one of these goddesses, is the name for the banshee in some parts of Ireland.
Oh.
So that's also interesting. And crows are associated with death, like as a death omen.
Mm-hmm.
Even though, you know, like, I'm not to explain it away, but if you feed crows, they will always be outside waiting, right. Watching. But them gathering outside the house is not a good sign in Irish folklore.
This is all very interesting. I didn't think about this feminine aspect of how the feminine seems to be more connected, or more closely connected, I should say, to this concept of death and the other world and all of that. I found that your article, I found it really, really interesting. So I suggest that everyone read that. It's the Symbolic Roles of Women in Death Ritual in Traditional Irish Society. And that will be linked.
I've got better at titles as time has gone on.
Well, it's very clear as to what this article is about. But anyway, yeah, that was, I didn't think about that, how important women are, and also how, yeah, the feminine is like a prominent figure. It's not repressed or oppressed. It's just everywhere. And I really like that as a woman. So I think that's great. Join us for part 2, where Jenny talks about the nature-based festival of Samhain, the idea that the dead can interact with the living during this time, how fairies and the dead are intermingled, plus much more.